Imagine walking into a hospital room every day, seeing the same boy lying motionless, his body unresponsive, and his eyes staring blankly into space. His name was Ethan, a 12-year-old who had been in a vegetative state for over a year after a tragic accident. The doctors had said it was unlikely he'd ever regain consciousness, that his mind was lost in a place unreachable by modern medicine. But for Nurse Emily, that was never enough. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan's story, something that no one else could see. Every day, she followed her routine, checking his vitals, adjusting the machines, and talking to him as though he could hear her, as though he could somehow respond. It was a ritual she had grown so accustomed to, but even in the quiet hospital room, Emily often felt an odd sense of hope. The doctors, his family, and even the other nurses all seemed to have accepted his condition, resigned to the idea that Ethan would never wake up. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She noticed things, small things that others didn't. A flicker of his eyelid, a slight movement of his fingers, an almost imperceptible change in his breathing pattern. Most would have dismissed it, but Emily didn't. To her, it was a sign, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, Ethan was still there, locked inside his own body, fighting to come back. But nothing could have prepared Emily for what would happen one fateful day, something that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about the boundaries of life, consciousness, and the human spirit. It started with a simple task, one that seemed so trivial to anyone else: changing the sheets in Ethan's bed. Yet as she moved him gently, something unexpected occurred. Ethan's hand, which had been completely still for months, twitched. A subtle movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make Emily freeze in place. She stared at his hand, waiting to see if it was just a reflex, something the body did on its own when being moved. But it wasn't. His fingers flexed again, more deliberately this time. Her heart pounded in her chest as she carefully adjusted his position, watching his hand as if it might move again. And then it happened. Ethan's eyes flickered, shifting ever so slightly, and for the briefest moment, Emily could have sworn she saw a flash of recognition in them. But it was gone in an instant. She stepped back, uncertain whether what she had seen was real or just her imagination playing tricks on her after so many months of caring for him. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of the machines monitoring Ethan's vitals, and yet Emily felt a growing sense of urgency. She needed to know for sure. Was it possible that Ethan was actually aware of his surroundings? Had he been trapped in his own body, fully conscious, for all this time? Or was this simply some strange coincidence, something the brain sometimes does when it's under stress or trauma? As Emily stood frozen, trying to make sense of the strange events unfolding before her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more profound was happening. She couldn't explain it, but she felt deep in her gut that Ethan was trying to communicate with her. She needed to find a way to prove it, to show everyone that the boy they had all written off as gone was still there, still fighting to return. Days passed, and Emily continued to care for Ethan as she always had. But now she couldn't stop thinking about that brief moment when he had moved. It was as though she could feel an energy in the room, something she couldn't quite place. She spent hours researching, reading medical journals, speaking with specialists, trying to understand what might be happening inside Ethan's body. But every answer she found seemed to fall short, leaving her with more questions than solutions. How could a child who had been in a vegetative state for so long possibly show signs of awareness? Was it even possible? It wasn't until one quiet afternoon that Emily would witness something so unbelievable, so beyond the realm of normal medical understanding, that it would change her life forever. She had just finished feeding Ethan, gently adjusting his position in the bed when it happened again. This time, his lips moved. It was almost imperceptible, so subtle that at first, Emily wasn't sure if it was real. But when she leaned in closer, straining to hear, she caught it. A soft whisper. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned over Ethan, heart racing. "Help me." The words barely reached her ears, but they were unmistakable. Emily gasped, her body stiffening in disbelief. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch his arm, desperately trying to ground herself in the reality of what was happening. She looked down at Ethan, who lay still once again, his eyes closed, his body unresponsive. Had she imagined it? Was it just a momentary glitch in her perception, brought on by the stress of caring for him every day? But as she stood there, stunned by what she had just heard, another thought began to take shape in her mind. If Ethan was capable of speaking, if he had somehow found a way to break free from the silence of his vegetative state, what else could he be capable of? Could he communicate? Could he tell her what had happened to him? What had caused his accident? Was it possible that Ethan had been aware all along, locked in his own mind, unable to escape the confines of his immobile body? With every passing day, Emily became more determined to uncover the truth. What was happening to Ethan? Was he truly conscious? Or was this just an incredible coincidence? As she delved deeper into his care, looking for answers where others saw only silence, she was about to uncover a secret so extraordinary that it would shatter her understanding of everything: life, consciousness, and the uncharted depths of the human experience. The days ahead would be filled with twists, with moments that would leave Emily gasping for breath, unsure whether what she was witnessing was reality or something beyond it. She knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening to Ethan was not just a medical mystery. It was something far more profound, and she was about to uncover it in the most unexpected way. But what Emily didn't know was that the truth she was seeking was far darker and more complex than she could have ever imagined. The answers she was looking for would force her to question everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the mysterious world beyond. And in the process, she would uncover a story so mind-boggling that it would leave the entire hospital, and anyone who heard it, utterly stunned. As the days stretched on, Emily grew more desperate, her search for answers becoming all-consuming. But just when she thought she was getting closer, something happened. Something so unbelievable that it would leave her questioning her own sanity. And that, dear viewers, is where our story truly begins. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whisper, "Help me," replayed in her mind over and over again, like a haunting echo that wouldn't let her go. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they had been delivered. Ethan had been unresponsive for so long that Emily had almost forgotten what it was like to see him react to anything at all. His body was like a shell, the fragile machine keeping him tethered to life, but without any of the spark of awareness that would make him truly him. At least that's what everyone had told her. But that whisper, it was undeniable. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Could Ethan really be aware of his surroundings? Could he actually hear her all this time, unable to express it? Emily spent the next few days analyzing every moment she'd spent with Ethan. Every shift in his eyes, every twitch of his fingers, every tiny breath she might have missed. But nothing else seemed to change. It was as though he was still trapped in the same place, the same prison of his own body, just as the doctors had said. She began to question herself. Was this a mistake? Had she misheard? Maybe it was just a figment of her imagination, some desperate wish for Ethan to respond after all these months of caring for him, wishing he could tell her something, anything. But the more Emily thought about it, the more she realized how unlikely that explanation was. She had been a nurse for years. She knew what was real and what wasn't. The next day, Emily made a decision. She couldn't let this go. She had to know the truth. She had to find a way to make Ethan communicate, to prove that there was more to his condition than anyone could understand. That afternoon, she found herself standing by Ethan's bedside once again, her hands trembling slightly as she checked his vitals. The same soft hum of machines filled the room, and the rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor was the only sound breaking the stillness. Emily was used to the quiet by now, but today it felt heavier, almost suffocating. "Ethan," she whispered softly, leaning closer to his ear. "Can you hear me?" She had asked him that question countless times over the past year, but this time it felt different. This time there was something in her voice, something that demanded an answer. Nothing happened at first. His chest rose and fell steadily with the breath of life, but there was no flicker in his eyes, no movement from his limbs. Emily watched him closely, willing him to do something, anything. For a moment, she wondered if she was just fooling herself. But then she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement at the corner of his lips. Was it a smile? No, it couldn't be. It was far too faint, too brief to be anything like a smile. But the movement was there, unmistakable. "Ethan." Emily's voice shook as she spoke again, more urgently this time. "Please, if you can hear me, just give me a sign. Anything." She took his hand gently in hers, feeling the coldness of his skin, the fragile pulse beneath her fingertips. "You've been so strong, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're not alone. I'm here. I'll never give up on you." For a few moments, the room was still. Emily waited, holding her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she expected, but she knew that something had to happen. She wasn't crazy. There was something here, something more than the doctors could explain, something more than anyone had realized. Then it came again. A faint movement. His fingers twitched, just enough for Emily to notice. She gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan," she whispered again, her voice trembling with excitement. "Please, please, show me that you're still in there. You're not gone. I know it." The twitching stopped as suddenly as it had started, but for Emily, it felt like a breakthrough. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though Ethan was trying to respond. He was trying to tell her something. She had to be sure. That night, after her shift ended, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat in her small apartment, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it just a coincidence? Could it have been a reflex, something entirely physical with no connection to consciousness? But Emily refused to believe that. She had seen the signs. They weren't just random movements. There was intention behind them, something that felt like a call for help. She couldn't let it go. The next day, Emily returned to the hospital early. She had called in advance to make sure she would be alone in Ethan's room, without any distractions. This time, she had a plan. She wasn't going to simply wait for something to happen. She was going to make it happen. When she walked into Ethan's room, the air felt thick with anticipation. The quiet hum of the machines seemed louder than usual, and the faint beeping of the heart monitor seemed to echo in her ears. Emily set down her bag and moved to Ethan's side. She gently adjusted his position, checking his vitals once more before sitting down beside him, her eyes locked on his face. "Ethan," she whispered, taking his hand once more. "I'm not leaving until you answer me. I know you're still here. I can feel it. Just give me a sign. Please." She watched him closely, her fingers lightly brushing his skin, her heart racing. She didn't know how long she sat there, but it felt like hours. And then, just as she was about to pull away, a soft sound broke the silence. It was so faint she almost missed it, a quiet, raspy sound coming from Ethan's throat. Emily froze, her eyes snapping to his face. He was trying to speak. The realization hit her like a wave, nearly knocking her off her feet. Ethan was trying to speak. Her hands shook with excitement as she leaned closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, please, I'm here. What do you need? What's happening?" For a moment, there was only silence, but then a breath. A faint rasping sound that became clearer with each passing second. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A voice, barely audible, rasped out the words, "Help me." Emily's heart stopped. It was the same whisper she had heard before, the one that had shaken her to her core. But this time, it was different. This time, she was sure. Ethan was awake. Ethan was aware. But what did it mean? What was happening to him? Emily sat by Ethan's side, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had heard the words, faint, raspy, but unmistakable. "Help me." The words reverberated in her mind, but they raised more questions than answers. How was this possible? The doctors had all but given up on Ethan, convinced that his body was merely a shell, no longer connected to the boy they once knew. Yet here he was, responding, if only just a little, but enough to make Emily believe there was something more. She leaned closer, her breath shaky as she whispered, "Ethan, can you hear me? Please, if you can, give me a sign. Tell me what you need. What happened to you?" There was no response. The machines continued their steady beeping, but Ethan's body lay motionless, like a puppet with its strings cut. For a moment, Emily felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her after all the long, lonely hours spent with him? But the rasping sound, the desperate plea, still echoed in her mind. She couldn't let it go. Ethan was in there. Somehow he was still in there. Determined, Emily made a decision. She wouldn't wait for another moment to slip by. She would find a way to communicate with him, even if it meant breaking every rule she had ever known. She had heard of cases where patients had been able to communicate through subtle movements, through slight shifts in their body language, but this was different. There was no precedent for what was happening to Ethan, and yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to tell her something important, something vital. She spent the next few hours researching everything she could find about patients in vegetative states, reading medical studies, scouring the internet for any hint, any clue that could explain what was happening. Most of the articles she found were filled with technical jargon, medical terms, and clinical explanations that left her more confused than when she started. But one article caught her eye, a story about a man who had spent years in a similar state, only to wake up and recall vivid memories of his time trapped in his own mind. It wasn't just a medical miracle, it was an awakening, an understanding that the brain could hold on to consciousness in ways no one had previously thought possible. Was Ethan experiencing the same thing? Could he truly hear everything that was happening around him, even when his body couldn't respond? The thought terrified her. What if he had been aware this entire time, trapped inside his own mind, unable to communicate? The emotional weight of that thought crushed her chest, and she felt a surge of guilt for every time she had doubted him, for every time she had resigned herself to the idea that he was gone. The more Emily thought about it, the more she became convinced that there was something more happening here than anyone realized. But as the days went on, the tension in her grew. She couldn't share this with anyone. The doctors would never believe her. They would dismiss it as wishful thinking, as a nurse's desperation to hold on to hope. But Emily couldn't ignore what she had witnessed. Ethan was trying to speak. He was trying to reach out, and she wouldn't stop until she understood why. The other nurses and staff at the hospital started to notice the changes in Emily. She had always been dedicated to her work, but now there was an intensity to her that seemed to consume her every moment. She wasn't just caring for Ethan anymore. She was on a mission, obsessed with the idea that he was aware of everything happening around him. She spent more time with him than anyone else, lingering at his bedside, talking to him, hoping for some kind of response. It didn't go unnoticed. Some of her colleagues were supportive, but others, particularly Dr. Martin, the head of the department, began to question her actions. Dr. Martin had always been a pragmatic man. He trusted science, relied on the evidence. He had been the one to break the news to Ethan's family, telling them that their son was unlikely to ever wake up. It was a cold clinical decision, but it was based on the data. The scans had shown no brain activity, no sign of higher function. But now, Emily's behavior was becoming more erratic. She was acting on a gut feeling, a hunch that seemed impossible to prove. He had warned her to be careful, that it wasn't healthy to invest so much hope in a patient who was clearly beyond saving. But Emily refused to listen. One evening, as Emily sat by Ethan's side, staring intently at his still face, something shifted. She could feel it in the air, a subtle change that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. For the first time in days, Ethan's fingers twitched again, this time more distinctly. His thumb brushed against hers in a movement so slight it could have been mistaken for a reflex. But Emily knew better. She was sure of it now. He was trying to communicate with her. Her pulse quickened, and she gripped his hand tighter. "Ethan, I'm here. I know you're trying to tell me something. Please just give me a sign. Anything." There was nothing but silence for a long moment. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Emily felt herself holding her breath as she waited for some kind of response. But nothing happened. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, and doubt began to creep in. Was she chasing a ghost? Was it all in her mind? Then, just as she was about to pull away, she noticed something. It was a flicker, barely noticeable, but there. His eyes. They had moved. Not much, just a tiny shift of the eyelids, as though he were trying to focus on her face. Emily leaned forward, her heart racing. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, if you can hear me, show me." And then it happened. The faintest hint of a sound, something that might have been a sigh, or perhaps a breath. It was the most subtle thing, but it sent a shiver through Emily's spine. She was sure now. Ethan was awake. He was aware. But how could this be possible? How was he able to communicate in such a minimal way? The weight of the moment hung in the air. Emily could feel the tension mounting, a storm brewing just outside her reach. Would Dr. Martin believe her? Would he understand what was happening? Or would he dismiss it as another one of her desperate attempts to hold on to hope? As he stepped inside the room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, whether she was ready or not. Dr. Martin stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an undeniable weight. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she turned to face him, her hand still tightly gripping Ethan's. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the motionless figure in the bed. She could feel the electricity in the air, the unspoken tension between them. It was as though the room had become a battlefield, one side held by the cold reality of medical science, and the other by Emily's gut feeling, her belief that Ethan was somehow still there, still fighting. Dr. Martin's eyes flipped toward Ethan, then back to Emily. His expression was stern, yet there was something else there, something that looked almost like concern. Emily knew that look. It was the same expression he had worn when he first told her that Ethan had no chance of recovery. It was the look of a doctor who had made peace with a difficult diagnosis, who had long since accepted the inevitable. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been watching you these last few days. You're spending an excessive amount of time with Ethan. I understand your dedication, but this is getting out of hand." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just caring for him anymore. You're clinging to a hope that isn't grounded in reality. I've told you time and time again, Ethan is in a persistent vegetative state. His brain has ceased to function. He's gone." Dr. Martin's words hit her like a blow to the stomach, and for a moment, she felt herself falter. The doubt began to creep in, just for an instant, before she steadied herself. "No," Emily said, her voice rising slightly, though she kept her tone controlled. "I'm not giving up on him. I know he's still here. I've heard him. He's trying to communicate. He's trying to tell me something." Dr. Martin's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. He walked closer to Ethan's bedside, his eyes scanning the boy's unchanging form. "Emily, I'm telling you this for your own good," he said, his voice softer now but still firm. "You're emotionally invested in this situation. I understand why, but you're not seeing it clearly. I'm afraid you might be projecting your hopes onto a patient who can no longer respond." Emily felt her pulse quicken, and she knew she couldn't let him shake her. She refused to back down now, not when she was so sure of what she had heard, what she had seen. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been here. I've been with him every day. I know he's still in there." Dr. Martin studied her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Emily," he said, his tone softer now, almost compassionate. "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to make this harder on you. But you have to let go. This obsession is unhealthy." Before Emily could respond, a sound interrupted them. A soft, strained breath from Ethan's direction. It was so faint at first, it could have been mistaken for the rustling of the sheets or the hum of the machines, but Emily heard it, clear as day. She turned toward Ethan, her breath catching in her throat. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing his cold hand, as she whispered, "Ethan, please. If you can hear me, give me a sign." And then it happened again. A soft, strained noise from Ethan's throat, almost like a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help, me." It was the same sound she had heard before, the words that had haunted her, the words that filled her with a mixture of dread and hope. Dr. Martin's eyes widened, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice faltering for the first time. "Did you hear that?" Emily said, her voice urgent, her eyes locked on Ethan. She reached out to hold his hand more firmly, her whole body trembling with the sudden intensity of the moment. "He's trying to talk. He's still here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dr. Martin stood frozen, his gaze fixed on Ethan, as though he was trying to process what he had just heard. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Emily's hands shook as she kept holding onto Ethan, desperately waiting for another sign. Was this it? Was this the breakthrough she had been hoping for, or was she imagining it all? Suddenly, the heart monitor beeped faster. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the screen. It was as though Ethan's body was responding to something. An increase in heart rate, a rise in respiration. She couldn't believe it. The doctors had said his body was shutting down, that his mind was gone, but now everything seemed to be changing. So quickly, so suddenly. "His heart rate is spiking," Emily said, her voice filled with panic. "Dr. Martin, we need to do something. He's responding. He's alive." Dr. Martin glanced at the monitor, his brow furrowed in confusion. He moved to check the machines, pressing buttons and adjusting settings. But his movements were mechanical, almost robotic. Emily could tell he was skeptical, but he couldn't deny the data in front of him. Ethan's body was reacting. Something was happening, and it wasn't just a coincidence. "Emily, I need you to step back," Dr. Martin said, his voice now strained. "We need to stabilize him. This could be a shock response. We need to be sure." But Emily didn't move. She refused to. She couldn't. She needed to know. She needed to understand what was happening. She squeezed Ethan's hand once more and whispered, "Come on, Ethan. You can do it. I'm here. You're not alone." Then, in a sudden, almost terrifying moment, Ethan's eyes fluttered open. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what Emily had feared and hoped was true. Ethan was awake. Ethan was alive. But as the doctors scrambled to assess the situation, another chill filled the room, and Emily's heart froze. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The air felt thick, like something was closing in, something she hadn't anticipated. What was happening to Ethan? What did it mean that he had suddenly come back? Emily knew one thing for certain now. Nothing was going to be the same again. The moment Ethan's eyes flickered open, the room seemed to warp in a way Emily couldn't explain. A cold draft swept through, though no windows were open, and the lights above flickered erratically. For a brief moment, everything felt wrong, like the world had shifted just slightly off its axis. Her pulse raced as she leaned in, her hands trembling, ready to hear Ethan's voice, ready for some kind of sign, some kind of communication. But instead, his eyes closed again, and everything fell eerily quiet. The monitors beeped steadily, the rhythm of his heart slowing to what seemed like a normal pace. But Emily's instincts told her that something wasn't right. There was an underlying tension in the air, something she couldn't put her finger on. A sense that, for all the hope she felt, they had only just entered a darker, more mysterious phase. Dr. Martin was at the foot of the bed now, his back to Emily as he focused on the readings, making quick adjustments to the machines. "This is unexpected," he muttered under his breath, a rare crack in his usually confident demeanor. Emily wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She was torn between overwhelming relief and a growing sense of dread that gnawed at her from the pit of her stomach. What had just happened? Why had Ethan's eyes opened for only a second, like a fleeting glimpse of something deeper, and then shut again as if nothing had happened? Dr. Martin turned to her with a sharp look, his face pale. "Nurse Emily, I need to be honest with you," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "This isn't normal. There are no medical explanations for this kind of response. We need to observe him more closely. I'm increasing his sedatives for now." Emily's breath caught. "No," she said firmly, her voice rising with an edge she couldn't hide. "We can't do that. Not yet. You don't understand. He's trying to come back. He needs me." She reached out to Ethan, her fingers gently brushing his forehead, the warmth of his skin strangely reassuring. The feeling of his pulse beneath her fingers reminded her that this wasn't just a dream. Ethan was there, and he was fighting to be heard. Dr. Martin's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. We've done everything we can for him. The fact that his body is reacting doesn't change the reality of his condition. You're holding on to false hope, and I can't allow you to jeopardize his health any further." Emily's chest tightened, her resolve only growing stronger in the face of his dismissal. She couldn't back down now, not when she knew something was happening, something far beyond the scope of what science could explain. She had been by Ethan's side every day, watching, waiting, listening. She had felt the subtle shifts, the odd moments where he seemed to respond. This wasn't a coincidence. Without another word, she turned back to Ethan, her eyes scanning his features. His breathing was steady now, but there was something in his expression that unsettled her. It was as though he were caught between two worlds. His body lying still in the hospital bed while something else, Something deeper pulsed just beneath the surface. And then, just when she thought she could breathe again, Ethan's lips parted. It was almost imperceptible, a barely audible sound, but it was enough to stop Emily in her tracks. "Help me," he rasped, the words as faint as a whisper in a dream, but unmistakable. Her heart stopped for a beat as she leaned in closer. "Ethan, it's me. I'm here." His eyes fluttered open once more. This time, though, they didn't close. They remained locked on Emily, dark and wide with an intensity that she hadn't seen before. She felt a rush of relief, but then something else, something darker, began to cloud her mind. The way his gaze held hers wasn't like before. It was as though there was a deep understanding behind those eyes, a flicker of recognition, but something was off. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely himself. It was as though something had shifted within him, a change that was both unsettling and inexplicable. Dr. Martin noticed the change, and his face went pale. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. He was no longer dismissing the situation, now staring at Ethan as though he were seeing him for the first time. "Ethan," Emily whispered, her hand gently touching his, trying to anchor him to the world around him. "Can you hear me? Can you understand?" For a long moment, Ethan remained silent, his eyes tracing Emily's face, as if trying to find something familiar in her expression. Then, to Emily's shock, his lips parted again. This time, the words that followed sent a chill through her veins. "It's not me," he murmured, his voice rough, almost as if it were coming from a distant place. The words felt like a knife, piercing through the moment of clarity she had been holding on to. She recoiled slightly, her heart racing. "What do you mean, Ethan? What's not you?" Her voice trembled as she tried to make sense of his words. This wasn't the boy she had cared for all this time. Something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong. But before she could press further, the machines began to beep erratically. The heart rate monitor shot up, the screen flashing wildly, as if it were warning them of an impending catastrophe. Ethan's body stiffened, and his eyes rolled back in his head for a moment, a dark shadow passing over his face. Emily's pulse skyrocketed, panic surging through her. She grabbed for the button to call for help, but then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The room fell silent again. Emily's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she looked down at Ethan. He was still breathing, but his face was now blank, his eyes closed once more. The steady beep of the monitor returned, and for a moment, Emily felt as though she might lose herself entirely in the uncertainty. Dr. Martin was frozen in place, his hand still hovering over the controls, his mind clearly scrambling to catch up with the bizarre turn of events. He exchanged a glance with Emily, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Something's not right," he muttered, his voice unsteady. "We need to get him into intensive care, now." But Emily couldn't move. She was caught in the weight of Ethan's cryptic words, the sense that he had said something important, something she couldn't yet understand. What did he mean? She whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "It's not him." "What does that mean?" The air in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second, as if something, or someone, was watching them. The moment that had felt like a breakthrough now seemed to hold an ominous warning. Emily wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. Ethan wasn't just fighting for his life. There was something else at play, something far darker than she had imagined. And the deeper she went, the more it seemed that the answer she sought would come at a terrifying price. Emily's mind raced as she stood there, watching Ethan's still form. The room was too quiet now, too heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. What had he meant when he said, "It's not me"? The words echoed in her mind, the ominous tone behind them growing more pronounced with every passing second. She turned to Dr. Martin, who was still staring at the monitors, his face pale with disbelief. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What do you think he meant?" Dr. Martin didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the screens, but his hands were trembling. After what felt like an eternity, he turned to her, his expression full of uncertainty. "Emily, I don't know what's happening here. This isn't possible. His brain activity, it's fluctuating in ways I've never seen. I don't understand it." A cold dread washed over Emily. She had known for days, maybe longer, that something was different about Ethan's condition. But this was something beyond what she had imagined. It was as if he had glimpsed something in that brief moment of consciousness, something that shouldn't exist in the world they knew. The heart monitor beeped again, the sound sharp and fast, a rhythmic alarm that sliced through the thick tension in the air. Emily's breath hitched as she watched Ethan's chest rise and fall more rapidly now. His eyes, though closed, seemed to be twitching beneath his eyelids, as though he were dreaming or caught in some kind of internal struggle. And then it happened. Ethan's fingers twitched. It was so subtle at first, Emily almost doubted it, but then his hand moved again, and this time his fingers curled around hers. The sensation was electric, sending a shock through her system, a rush of warmth that made her heart leap into her throat. She couldn't breathe for a moment, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. Was this really happening? Was Ethan really coming back to her? "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, barely daring to break the silence. She leaned down, her forehead brushing his. "Ethan, can you hear me? Can you speak to me?" The tension in the room thickened as she waited for an answer, her heart hammering in her chest. Then slowly his eyelids fluttered open. This time there was no confusion, no blank stare. His eyes were clear, focused on her with an intensity that made her pulse race. He was awake. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. But his gaze, as it locked with hers, was not the same as before. It wasn't just the Ethan she knew. There was something more, something darker, something distant in his eyes. "Ethan," Emily said softly, her voice trembling with relief. "You're back. You're really back." He blinked once, slowly, and then, just as her heart soared with hope, his lips parted. The words that came next were not what she expected, and they hit her like a punch to the gut. "It's not over yet," he rasped, his voice hoarse, as if it had been unused for far too long. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, leaning closer to him, searching his face for any sign of clarity. "What's not over?" But before he could respond, the machines in the room began to screech, louder, more insistent than ever before. The heart monitor flatlined, and the alarms grew frantic. Emily's heart stopped. No, this couldn't be happening again. Dr. Martin rushed to the machines, pushing buttons frantically, trying to stabilize the readings. "His vitals are plummeting. I need help in here," he shouted. But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from Ethan. His hand was still gripping hers, but now it was cold, too cold, and his breathing had become shallow again. His eyes, which had once been so clear, began to glaze over once more. "No," Emily cried out, gripping his hand tighter, her voice breaking. "Stay with me, Ethan, please." The room seemed to spin as everything around her descended into chaos. Dr. Martin was shouting orders, the nurses rushing in and out, but Emily couldn't focus on any of it. All she could do was stare at Ethan, her mind racing for an answer, for a way to fix this. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the madness stopped. The alarm ceased, the frantic beeping giving way to a steady, rhythmic sound. The monitor showed that Ethan's heart rate had returned to normal, but there was no mistaking the look on his face. He was fading, his body still clinging to life, but there was a vacancy in his eyes, something missing. Dr. Martin stepped back, his face grim. "We're losing him," he said quietly. His voice, usually so controlled, cracked with the weight of the words. Emily felt a surge of panic, of helplessness, wash over her. No, not again. He was just here. He was talking to me. Dr. Martin's hand hovered near the machines again, his gaze flickering between the screens and Ethan's motionless form. "I don't understand," he murmured. This isn't just a medical anomaly. There's something else happening here, something I can't explain." The room was heavy with silence for a moment, and then Ethan's lips parted again. Emily leaned forward, her breath held tight in her chest. His voice came out as a whisper, barely audible, but to her, it was like a lifeline. "It's not over. Yet." The words made no sense, and yet, in the deepest corners of her heart, she knew they held the key. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her bones. Ethan wasn't gone. Not completely. There was something more to this, something beyond the science they had all clung to. Something beyond the explanation of medical charts and sterile procedures. "Ethan," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "What do you need? Tell me." And then, just as quickly as he had come back, Ethan's eyes fluttered closed one last time. The room fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Emily sat there, her hand still clutching his, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no answers, just questions and a deep, unshakable sense that this was far from over. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. No matter how this ended, no matter what secrets Ethan was hiding, she would be with him every step of the way. The final twist came when she noticed something strange. On the very edge of Ethan's pulse, just at the bottom of the monitor's graph, a faint, irregular line flickered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ethan's story wasn't finished. Not yet. And whatever it was, she was going to find out what was really going on, no matter where it took her. As the days went by, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the ordinary was happening with Ethan. His condition remained delicate, but there was an undeniable sense of life in him that had not been there before. She watched him closely, every twitch of his fingers, every slight change in his breathing, hoping for another sign, hoping for the answers that seemed just out of reach. The faint, irregular line on the monitor that she had seen, the one that flickered ever so slightly, as if it were a whisper of life, had continued. At first, Emily thought it was a glitch, some odd anomaly in the machines. But the more she observed, the more certain she became that it was something else, something far more mysterious. Each day, it seemed to grow stronger, as if whatever force had briefly brought Ethan back from the brink was still lingering, hidden beneath the surface. Emily had kept this discovery to herself, unsure whether anyone else would believe her, especially with the medical team so focused on stabilizing him. Dr. Martin had expressed his doubts when Emily shared her observations with them, but there was an unspoken agreement between them. Neither of them could deny the impossible. Ethan was not the same. The man lying in that hospital bed was somehow different from the boy they had once known. Emily spent her nights at Ethan's side, refusing to leave him, even as the doctors tried to encourage her to get some rest. She couldn't. She wouldn't. There was something about him, something about the way he held on when he should have let go, that kept her rooted there. She felt, deep down in her soul, that he was fighting to come back. But what was he fighting for? And what would be left of him once he finally woke up fully? On the 5th night after Ethan had uttered his last words, Emily found herself standing by the window in his room, staring out at the quiet city below. The world felt so distant, so disconnected from the chaos of her life. She turned back to look at Ethan's still form, her heart heavy with uncertainty. That's when it happened. His fingers twitched again, a slow, deliberate motion. This time, Emily didn't wait for anyone else to notice. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she took hold of his cold hand. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the beeping of the machines. "Please, if you can hear me, give me a sign." For a long moment, nothing happened. Emily was starting to lose hope, wondering if perhaps she had been imagining things. But then, just when she was about to pull her hand away in defeat, Ethan's hand squeezed hers. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to him, her heart racing. "Ethan?" she said again, her voice cracking. "Can you hear me?" For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his eyes fluttered open. This time they were clear, filled with recognition. But there was something different about the way he looked at her. It wasn't just the Ethan she had known. This was something else. A shadow of him, yet unmistakably still him. His lips parted, and for a moment, Emily's breath caught in anticipation. I remember," he said, his voice raspy but strong. "I remember everything. But it's not all mine. There's something else in me." The words sent a chill through Emily's body. This was not just about a boy waking up from a coma. This was about something far more profound. She had feared it, and now the truth was crashing down on her. Ethan's experience had not been merely physical. There was something else, something that transcended the boundaries of the body and the mind. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Ethan's gaze drifted to the ceiling, his eyes unfocused for a moment, as if searching for something just beyond his reach. "I'm not the same," he whispered, his words barely audible. I was in a place where I could hear things, feel things, but they weren't real. And I knew, deep down, that if I didn't get out of there, I'd never wake up." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if Ethan had crossed into another realm, a place between life and death, a place where only he knew the rules. She could feel it now, the sense of something lingering within him, something that had come back with him. "It wasn't just the accident, was it?" Emily asked softly. There was something more. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression distant. "I don't know how to explain it. It was like I was trapped, but not alone. There were other people, other voices. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. They were trying to get me to stay, but I couldn't. I couldn't let go, Emily. Not like that." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she clutched his hand tighter. "You're here now. That's all that matters. You're here." But Ethan shook his head. "I don't know for how long. I don't know what's in me, but I can feel it. It's pulling me. I'm not sure I can fight it again." The uncertainty in his voice sent waves of fear crashing through Emily. She had fought so hard to bring him back. She couldn't lose him now, not after everything they had been through. But deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about physical recovery. Ethan had crossed a threshold, and whatever had happened to him in the coma was beyond anything the doctors could explain. As the days passed, Ethan's condition stabilized, but the strange otherworldly presence that seemed to linger around him remained. It was as if his body had returned, but his soul, his very essence, was still divided. He would have moments of lucidity where he was entirely himself, but then there would be times when his eyes would cloud over, and he would speak in riddles, or speak of things no one could understand. Emily stayed by his side, never leaving him for more than a few minutes. She couldn't bear the thought of him slipping away again, especially when he had so much more to tell. There were truths buried deep within him, things he hadn't even begun to understand himself. It wasn't until the night of the full moon that everything changed. As the moonlight filtered through the windows of his hospital room, Ethan sat up suddenly, his eyes wide with panic. "They're coming," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "I can hear them. They won't let me go." Emily's heart sank. It was happening. The pull was too strong. The force that had been silently shaping his fate was now more powerful than ever. She gripped his hand tightly, willing herself to stay calm. "They won't take you," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I'm here, Ethan. I'll protect you." But as he looked at her, his gaze seemed to shift, as though someone, or something, else was looking back at her. A flicker of recognition flashed in his eyes, but it was fleeting. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I have to go." With that, Ethan's body went still once more, his eyes closing, and the room fell silent. Emily stared at him, her heart heavy with sorrow and confusion. But as the last of the moonlight faded from his face, she realized the truth. Ethan had made his choice. He had fought, and in the end, it wasn't just his battle to win. There were forces beyond their understanding at play, and sometimes, no matter how hard you fought, you couldn't escape them. But that didn't mean he hadn't fought for her, for them, for the love they had shared. And in that moment, as the silence enveloped her, Emily knew that Ethan's journey was far from over. Whatever had taken him, wherever he had gone, she would find a way to bring him back. The story wasn't finished, and she wouldn't rest until she had answers.